Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is my thoughts on the or this is my reaction to the fight of Richardson Hitchins defeating George Kambosos with a really nice vicious body shot, and stuff like that. I think it was like in like the kind of like the middle part, like right, like kind of like right here. Oh, I got some shit on my shirt, but like but it was like right there, and shit like that, But it was a really nice body shot, But then he stopped them in let me go look. So he stopped. So Richardson Hitchins stopped George Kambosos in round 8, and honestly, for the amount of knockouts that he has, like just like I said, he has very underrated he has very underrated boxing skill and power. I mean, very underrated power, and stuff like that, and as long as he knew how to you know know that he was the man in the fight, and shit like that, like the better man in the fight, and utilize that, that he has way more skill, and that, when it comes down to skilled fighters, like George Kambosos struggles, and as long as he knows that and he sticks to that game plan, and he can be able to utilize whatever he got to do and shit like that, like he could win this fight. It's just, and that's the thing, and that's what he did, and stuff like that. And the one thing with George Kambosos, it's like, he's not a bad fighter. It's just like styles make fights. Like I just really feel like that they need to give him fights that he's actually gonna win, and shit like that, like, or it's just George Kambosos is just like he gets a lot of say because he has because of how of a popular fighter he is coming out of Australia, and shit like that, so like that's why he gets like more of a say, and shit like that, and he also has quite a bit of money and shit like that, I'm pretty sure from, fighting Vasily Lomachenko and, mainly fighting Devin Haney those 2 times, and shit like that, but that's the thing though and shit like that. But I'm pretty sure he got not too bad of a bag and shit, when he fought Lomachenko. But I think it's like almost around. I think he probably made more in this fight probably than the Lomachenko fight, and shit like that. I'm guessing, and shit like that. But anyways and shit like that, that's the thing and shit like that. He just needs to get, like those good, he needs to just get fighters that, are good, like, because he could beat undefeated fighters. Like, he could beat good fighters and shit like that, out there and shit, But he can only beat fighters that aren't, skilledly, technically skilled like that, and shit like that, like people like Lomachenko or people like Richardson Hitchins. I know Lomachenko's retired, but I mean, like, I'm just bringing him up because that's the guy that that he lost to, and got beaten up severely, and stuff like that in that fight. Not a single. Well, I think he won like 1 or 2 rounds, but then after that, he just got beat up that whole fight, and shit like that. But that's the thing and shit like that. But with Teofimo Lopez, let me end this clip real quick. But with Teofimo Lopez, like, that's the thing. Like, he's a skilled fighter, and shit like that. But I'm going to just phrase it like a defensively skilled fighter, and stuff like that. Like Lomachenko, who has great footwork, and can move the angles out of your way, like without you even noticing. And all you're noticing is just the punches, and with Richardson Hitchins, and stuff like that, like, he's able, like, he has really good defense, and shit like that. He can he can use different types of ways to utilize good defense and quick punching and everything, and Devin Haney, obviously we know with Devin Haney, he has great defense and shit like that, and lightning fucking quick footwork, that can get him out of, like, literally, like, he could be in front of a train, and a train can be like this close to him, and he could just move out the way and shit like that, and shit, he has very quick footwork, and quick, and, and just overall, just like the same thing with Richardson Hitchins, quick, like, good defense of different ways and shit like that, But that's the thing and shit like that, I'm not gonna go too much nerdy and shit and that shit, but I'm just saying, like, but but that's the thing and shit like that, and but with Teofimo Lopez, like that's the thing. It's like he lacks defense, very much so. Like he's a skilled fighter, a very very good offensively, offensively skilled fighter, and shit like that, and he oftenly, in I'm not gonna say he utilizes his defense like his offense, and shit like that, he can, I would say yeah he does. He uses his defense as his offense, but he also mixes it up something like, with defense, but not where it's like he can do it very well with, how he normally does things. Because how normally, like how Teal normally wins is that, he's an offensive fighter. Like he's going to be defensive when he needs to be defensive and shit like that. But then once he needs to win and go back to his winning circle, he's going to be an offensive fighter and get hit a lot, and shit like that, like that's the thing and shit like that, and that's kind of what Teofimo Lopez is, and stuff like that, so like that's the thing and shit like that, so like it's just there's a difference right there. Richardson Hitchins is a really good defensive fighter. Teofimo Lopez is not a really good defensive fighter and lacks defense. But they're both skilled fighters, but they're different levels and shit like that, when it comes down to that, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and yeah, and stuff like that, but yeah. And so basically, Kambosos, he could do good with that type of techniques where he's going against people who can be able to, utilize, who can be able to, they're a good fighter, but they're terrible at defense, and shit like that, not terrible at defense, but it's just more of like, they're not at a high level with defense. But honestly, I would say really that they really lack a defense, that they don't really use it a whole lot, and shit like that, just basically just a not defensive fighter at all, and shit like that, and basically Teo's kind of in that level, not in yet, yes and no, but it's just that's the thing and shit like that. It's like that's why I'm like like that's why I'm saying like he could still fight fighters and win against fighters who still have deep decent enough defense, or good enough defense, but just not elite. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and stuff like that. Loma, he might not have elite defense, but elite footwork, elite speed and everything. And that's what like makes, and Loma's Loma, and that's the thing and shit like that. There's levels in this, in boxing too. But I'm just saying like that, like he also includes into what I'm saying with the defensive part, and stuff like that, so that's the thing, man, and stuff like that, so it ain't over for George Kambosos, like that's what I'm saying, like it is not over for George Kambosos, like he can definitely, win, like he could definitely, like he could get more opportunities and shit like that, and and win fights, against good fighters, and shit like that. Even good fighters that are up and coming in that weight division and shit like that, at 140, which honestly, like, I want to see how he does at 140. I'm kind of 50-50 on at like for 140 for him. But I mean, overall he looks pretty solid for the weight class, but it's just more of the punches, and shit like that. Like he was getting like buzzed up very much. Like I like Richardson Hitchins has power, but like to get buzzed up like that, I don't know, and shit like that. I might need to look into it, but I'm just saying, but I'm just saying, like Kambosos can fight those kind of fighters and can win those fights. Because if he beat Teofimo Lopez, obviously he can beat different fighters and shit like that. Because Teofimo Lopez is a really tough fighter, and shit like that. So it's like, no matter what, he's gonna be around in the game, and he still is gonna get good fights, no matter what's gonna go on, because he has that win right there. That's gonna still solidify, because look how good Teofimo Lopez is, and shit like that. After that loss, like he literally went and beat up Josh Taylor, like, outboxed, Arnold Barboza. It was a really boring fight, and shit like that. Extremely boring fight. But I mean, he still outboxed him, and stuff like that, So he has good wins now, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, So, like, That's what I'm saying. So Kambosos can fight, man. But then the thing is with Richardson Hitchins, like Hitchins, he could fight like there's talks now that he might be fighting, like or little talks, like there has to still go through a little bit, but it was Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney. But honestly, I really hope he can get in there with Teofimo Lopez. Like Devin Haney, he might I wouldn't be there's other fights for Devin Haney, and shit like that. But honestly though, it's like we already know what Devin Haney's gonna do, and shit like that. Like he's like either way, he's just gonna run in that fight, and shit like that. Like that's the thing and shit like that. And the Hitchins, they're both defensive. It's like there's gonna be no action pack in that fight at all, and shit. But it's not that. It's just more of just you know, it's that, but it's just more of I want to see what he can do against Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that. Because right now, my opinion can change, but I'm just saying, right now, I'm just a little bit leaning more towards Teofimo Lopez. But I can't be wrong, though, and shit like that, because it's a really close fucking fight, because I mean, because it's just it can go either way, and shit like that. Like, literally, I just don't know. I'm just thinking because Teo, he has great power speed, he has great footwork, and shit like that, that I'm not saying elite footwork, but I'm just saying that matches up with his skill set to kind of be a good, offensively sound fighter, and shit like that, it mixes up very well, and shit like that, and going against somebody like Richardson Hitchins, it's like no fighter is gonna be too slow, too fast for Teo. Like he's gonna be able to land his punches. It's just about how you do it, and shit like that against Teofimo Lopez, realistically, and shit like that, So that's the thing and shit, So, but we'll see, man. We'll see how the fight's gonna work out. But yeah, let's talk about the fight though, and stuff like that. Honestly, Richardson Hitchins again, did everything I literally just said, and shit like that. Just know that you are you have every way to win this fight, and he did that. And stuff like that. He had every way that he could win the fight, and he did that. And stuff like that. So that's the thing. But it's just also his speed, it's just, and just everything. It's just everything that he does. It's he defends himself very well, and shit like that. He places his punches very well, and shit like that. It's just, he's a beautiful boxer, and shit like that. Richardson Hitchins, and stuff like that, But what I like is just his jab. I feel like just my favorite shot that he uses is his jab. That's what really did he hurt, oh shit, I gotta let my dog in. Hold up. But the one thing with Richardson Hitchins, you know, like the best tactic that I love about his boxing is his jab. He has a beautiful jab. He has a very, very beautiful jab, and shit like that, and he also has length too, and stuff like that, because he's also kind of kind of tall, and stuff like that. Actually, let me look how tall he is. More taller, and stuff like that. 5'10", 74-inch reach, but still he fights at a tall type of style, and shit like that, if you know what I mean. And he also fights, with and he also has, and he also has pretty long arms and shit like that, literally his arm length and shit, he has very good arm length, and stuff like that, not a crazy amount of arm length, but enough to where it fits with his elite, job, because either way with that reach, he could be able to have a beautiful jab and work with that jab against anybody. He wouldn't have a problem with not getting any space, and shit like that, But basically the whole point is that, he has a beautiful jab, man. It's just it's just it's quick, it has power, and stuff like that, and it just, he could use it in different types of angles and shit like that, where it's just sometimes he doesn't always have to just he could just sit back and just use the jab, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's what he does super, beautifully, and stuff like that with Richardson Hitchins, and stuff like that, So beautiful work, and shit like that, beautiful work. Cause, overall, I was because overall, like my full prediction, like I knew that he was gonna out that like the outcome, and this outcome was just of my prediction. But it's just more of like there was still ways for George Kambosos to win, where there was still competitiveness a little bit, and shit like that, So it's like that's the thing and shit, But it's just overall there was, I would have been more shocked if he beat Richardson Hitchins, way more shocked, appalledly more shocked if he literally and I'm not saying because but I'm just gonna finish my second sentence. If he beat George Kambosos beat Richardson Hitchins, I'll be way more appalledly shocked than when he beat Teofimo Lopez, because I was really shocked when that happened. Like I was like, what? Like literally, because obviously at that time with the whole Teofimo Lopez charade and shit, and even now, but I'm just saying back in the day was way worse, and shit like that, But I'm just saying though, it's just more of his attitude is like he's a lot more, just crooked now and shit like that, with Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, But the reason why I would be more shocked if Richardson Hitchins lost to Kambosos more than Teofimo Lopez losing to Kambosos is because I just feel like more stylistically, Teo was way more stylistically matched to Kambosos than Richardson Hitchins, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, because like Kambosos is not very quick with his footwork. It's just like, even though he can be and shit like that depending on the fight, but overall he's very kind of just just slow, and stuff like that. And mixed that he's also flat-footed too, and stuff like that. Being a flat-footed fighter does not make, like boxing very easy. I mean, you can still be a good fighter being a flat-foot fighter. It doesn't matter about damn, bro. Like, it doesn't matter about, you not being able to be good or anything like that, It's just more of like, to being able to properly, get away from danger and to properly be safe in the fights. Being flat foot isn't very much so, and shit like that. The bit, uh, like the easiest way, and shit like that, And that's the thing, and stuff like that, But, so that's the thing. It's just more of like, stylistically, it's just more of like, like they were more matched, and stuff like that. Because Teo, he's not a defensive fighter. He's an offensive fighter and stuff like that. That he'll, when you want to be in his range, he's gonna want to, Teal's gonna just, that's what he wants, is to be into your range and shit like that, because that's his own range, is being able to max out your range and shit like that, or take away your range and then just max in his own range and shit like that, but his own range is still kind of close though, and shit like that, it's, he'll be far away, and shit, know his distance, but then eventually he'll start going closer and shit like that, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, So that's what more so that's the reason why and shit. It's just more of he's not really a defensive fighter like Hitchins and shit like that. Hitchins, I just feel like everything of what Kambosos would have done, he would have seen everything, would have just defended everything. And that's the thing, he would have just seen everything, would have just defended everything, and it's just, that's what he would have done, man, and shit like that, So that's the thing and shit, and stuff like that, So it's just, stylistically, they're very different fighters for Kambosos, and stuff like that, So yeah, and shit like that, because it's proven against Devin Haney twice, and it's proven against, Lomachenko, and then now it's proven against, Richardson Hitchins. All of his losses came from defensively skilled fighters, and stuff like that, So that's the thing. But overall, good win, impressive win from Richardson Hitchins, and I just, like I'm definitely looking forward for, what's next for Richardson Hitchins, and shit like that, and overall it's gonna be good fights for Richardson Hitchins, and stuff like that. Because first and foremost, it's clear, it's clear because I mean he's been getting good fights, and stuff like that, so he's gonna be getting good fights, and overall there's, it's just like there's like certain fighters that's being said that he's already gonna be fighting, not like it's already like official, like, like there's like if they're saying like it's like official, but like it's just they're throwing it out there, but it's just more of like if they're throwing it out there, that's most likely gonna be their option, but it still could be, but Hitchens could still fight somebody else, and stuff like that, other than Haney or Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, but I would like to see that happen though, and shit like that between those two. And I would overall like to see him like to fight Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, because overall that would bring, stylistically, like a very good fight because both fighters are different, in their elite ways, and stuff like that, So that's the thing and shit like that, So that's what's gonna make the fight a very tough fight, between those two, and shit like that, So yeah. But thank y'all for watching this video. I'm like so what I'm gonna do, like, like I'm a let's see.